Welcome to Year of Connection, a year-long journey toward becoming whole self-connected. I'm your host, Pauline Shu. This is the 26th episode, marking the halfway point in this year. We're going to do a review and check-in today of the past 6 months. We are also going to talk about how your age and phase of life might play a role in prioritizing connections, as well as look at where you want to take your connections in the future. I almost can't believe half a year has already passed since the first episode of Year of Connection. I hope that you have found these discussions helpful and that you feel more connected than you did at the start of the year. Let's start this episode by doing a review to see how exactly your connections have developed. We're going to go way back to your list of core values and your standards of behavior. Take a moment to look at those. How do you feel about them now? Remember what we talked about back in episode 2, that core values are where we build happiness in our own selves? So when you look at the list of core values that you made back at the start of this year of connection, the ones that I asked you to also review in episode 12, when we talked about connection and balance, do you notice any changes that might need to be made to your core values now? Since we had our last review in episode 12, the thematic focus of the Year of Connection episodes has been on outward-facing connections, which find their foundation in your established core values and standards of behavior. So if you do find that your core values have changed with any significance since then, or since episode 1, go back and rework your way through these later episodes. You will likely find that your approach and thoughts around them are different if you have different core values. But once you're back here, or if you've stayed here, it's time to look at your connections grid and to also consider your core connections. These two might not have changed significantly if your core values have not changed significantly, but I would ask you anyway to reflect for a moment on any new names that might have appeared since we started this journey. And I would also say, take some time to mourn any names that might have fallen off your list of core connections. Do take that time because, as I know I've said before, these aren't just disembodied names floating around on a list. They represent real people with real feelings, desires, and needs just like you. For those in your connections grid who have become or remained strong core connections, the positivity and support they add to your life should be duly appreciated, while the loss of a connection should be grieved, if only because it teaches us that we are all vulnerable and fortunate at the same time. I'm going to share an example from my own journey this year. Remember back in episode 9 when I talked about fear of missing out and jealousy? I shared a story about a woman with whom I wanted to be friends, but we somehow hadn't yet connected at that level. Nearly 4 months later, I am happy to say we are friends. Our friendship is still developing, following the same slow trajectory as it did when it first started, but she is someone whose core values are in line with mine and whose life phase is similar to mine. It's a good fit, so I'm not concerned that this pace isn't fast enough. We'll get there when we get there. Letting go over any unhappiness over not having her as a friend went a long way toward opening up my mind toward a slower developing friendship. And now, here we are. On the flip side, as I go through the connections grid that I've made, I realize that some names have fallen off the list. Some names simply have fewer check marks when it comes to my list of core values. And that is more because I've gotten to know my core connections better and deeper using some of my own strategies than it is that my core values have changed. In fact, my core values have stayed very much the same since the start of the year, though I did make a couple of edits to ones that I had already written down based on things that I had noticed by taking my life notes. Speaking of, how are your life notes coming? For a while, mine had turned into pages of lists because it had been so busy, but as my children were wrapping up their school year, I had more time to think, to doodle, to write out philosophical questions, and to try to understand myself and others better through the simple method of pen on paper. Go ahead and take a moment, look back, see if there's anything that stands out at you that you want to note that maybe has either changed over time or has appeared in a way that hadn't been there before. Time has a way of revealing things that nothing else is capable of doing. And that brings us to the next part of this episode, how our age and phase of life influence our connections. If you're a teen or a young adult, the activities you've joined in this past few months are probably going to look different from those of a middle-aged woman with kids or an older person who's living alone. So it's important to understand that this journey is a constant and constantly evolving one. If you've traveled this road with me for the past 6 months and your core values and core connections are still changing drastically, it's possible that you're entering a new phase of life, rather than that you haven't grown in your connectedness. This is especially possible if you're on the younger side. We change so much in the earlier part of our life, much more and much faster than later on. Despite the rapid changes of our childhood years, though, our worlds should continue to get bigger as we get older, not stay the same or even shrink. And that is part of this journey toward whole self-connectedness. The bigger the web, the more connection points it requires and the more resilient it becomes. Although the challenges we face as we have the responsibilities of jobs, mortgages, children, healthcare can feel limiting and might stand in the way of easy expansion, making a conscious effort to grow our worlds as older, more responsibility-laden adults is critical in ensuring that we leave a legacy of connection behind. If we are parents, we should be helping our children's worlds to grow safely. We'll be talking in a future episode specifically about how to parent our children through their connections, but it's important to understand in this discussion that each phase of life can cause drastic changes to our core values, as well as to our core connections and standards of behavior, if for no other reason than the lessons we learn about others along the way. Compare, for example, your closest connections now with those you had 10 years ago. Take a moment to reflect on how have they changed? What were your connections based on back then versus now? If they have changed, why did they change? Perspective, for example, which we talked about in episode 11, might play an enormous role in the reason why your connections have changed over time. Ultimately, this year of connection isn't actually just a year-long process. It's an ongoing, cyclical one. Although we are taking stock at a mid-year point, we can use this process to evaluate our evolution of connection using any time period in our lives. Core values, core connections, standards of behavior, life notes, managing our feelings of jealousy, anger, and fear, being able to ask for and give forgiveness, disconnecting from the overstimulation of technology, and more are all useful at any phase of life because these are all tools we use to build and strengthen connection. But there's one important skill that we haven't yet covered that we'll focus on next week as we begin the second half of this year. And that is empathy. Empathy and perspective go hand in hand. They are truly two important skills that require mastering the use of your tools of connection, and they contribute to a significantly higher quality of connection. Take the first part of this week to look back, to see how far you've come, and then start moving forward. Think more on how your phase of life is influencing your connections, where you want to be by the end of next month, next year, and even the next phase of life. Looking toward the future, where do you see yourself, and how do you want others to see you when it comes to connection? If you want, you can write some of your thoughts in your life notes. We'll be talking about these things in conjunction with empathy next week. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed listening to this episode or any other Year of Connection episodes, consider leaving a rating or review on iTunes or any other app you're listening on. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. In the meantime, I wish you safe travels.